Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm happy to see so many people here, and hopefully, some more will be trickling in the first few minutes. I am so excited to be here. My name is Mo. I am a third year doctoral student at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and I have the privilege of moderating today's panel, which is titled Reading the Room: My Career Journey of Effective Communication. So to briefly introduce our panelists today, first we have Steph Isiela. They received their PhD in English from Emory University and currently serve as the Director of Digital Initiatives at Georgia Humanities. They previously served as Director of Information and Education at the Alliance for Higher Education in Prison, as well as President of the Board of Directors for Reforming Arts. Steph's journey exemplifies the power of effective communication in diverse settings. Our second panelist, Ernesto Chanona, brings his expertise in cancer immunology to the world of biotechnology. As the leader of Business Development and Government Affairs Division at CSSI Life Sciences, he helps pharmaceutical and medical device companies navigate regulatory approval, strategic partnerships, and market entry. And his multifaceted career showcases the importance of effective communication in bridging the gap between science and business. And our third panelist, Cindy Layton, is a trailblazer in the field of life sciences. She founded the Pharma and Biotech Job Seekers Group for Transitioning Academics on LinkedIn, where she connects academic job seekers with industry professionals. And her background in molecular and cellular biology, combined with her roles at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals and Yale, demonstrates how effective communication can empower scientists towards innovation and collaboration. So very hearty welcome to our three panelists today. Okay, so the ability to read the room can enhance one's ability to effectively communicate with an audience, and our panel of experts will share their personal and professional insights on the art of effective communication and its influential role in their careers. So to get us started, I just wanted to point out that all three of you are representing very different backgrounds, but all seem to be managing taking multiple interests and passions and making them into a career, which is pretty amazing. So can each of you briefly describe your career journey and how effective communication has played a role in your success?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to kick us off. Thanks so much for that introduction, Mo. And so I, as the lone humanities person on the panel, I will briefly talk about kind of where I started in grad school and sort of trace a brief trajectory of how I've gotten to sort of where I am today. And so I think the moment that I realized or like really became aware of my communication style was when my dissertation chair said that the only problem with my writing was that it was too accessible. And I was like, that's a thoroughly bizarre thing to say to me. Because I was under the impression that that was actually the goal of writing, was to render your ideas clear to an audience. But no, that was the criticism. It was too accessible. So back to the drawing board, make it more, jargon heavy. And so it occurred to me in that moment that without the obscure words and like unintelligible theory, my writing somehow was too simple, which meant that my ideas were too simple. But that to me didn't track. And so it was that comment that actually like kind of rang in my mind when I decided like I don't want to pursue a traditional academic job. Like want no part of it. Like I'm out. And I just didn't want to be part of a culture and part of an institution where like unintelligibility became a proxy measure for like sophisticated thought and like good work. That just didn't ring true to me. So I kind of took a left turn out of that world and began working in higher ed in prison. And that was sort of a natural transition actually, because my dissertation research focused on the trajectory from transatlantic slavery to the prison industrial complex via representations in literature. And so in the process of doing that work, it became obvious to me that it was one thing to sit and theorize about prisons, and it was another thing to actually like make a difference in the world. And so I decided I wanted to do the latter. And so that's how I ended up teaching in prisons. But for me, that was also where I saw Paulo Freire's statement that education is the practice of freedom really play out. And one of my students at one point said, like, the things that we know and the things that we read and learn are the only things that can't be taken away from us here. And that statement, like, has always stayed with me. And so for me, like education and being able to render things clear to a diversity of audiences was actually a matter of like equity and access. Um, so like making the obscure understandable for me is like a really important kind of cornerstone of the way I think about like justice in my work. And that is true even today as I'm finishing my last semester of law school. I spend a lot of time making the law understandable to people who are outside of the legal field. And I feel like for me, again, that's all about equity and access and justice. And so that is sort of the brief arc of how I've kind of gotten from grad school to where I am now. And I'd be happy to answer any questions about that later, but I'll hand it off to one of my panelists, co-panelists. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steph. So I'm Ernesto Chinona, and as Mel kind of alluded to, I lead the government affairs and business development team at a regulatory consultancy called CSSI Life Sciences. I also teach at Hopkins. I was an undergrad at Hopkins, graduated with my biology degree, but I'm also an adjunct professor at the business school. And I serve as the chairman for the the governor's Hispanic Affairs Commission. And so I interact a lot with many different audiences. In a similar vein to Steph, it's a lot about translating complex science to folks that are not in the scientific field. And in business development, you are at this intersection between the entrepreneur and the scientist and a lot of other stakeholders in the community, like investors, like their contract research partners and their manufacturing partners in our group here, which is by extension the communication with the US FDA. Through my work at nonprofits, I was previously on the board of directors of the American Red Cross, but I have since stepped down from that role to take on this role at the Hispanic Affairs Commission. And any type of work that you do, especially as you're stepping outside, and even within the academic sector, but really when you step outside the academic sector, it's all about managing expectations. This is what communication boils down to for me, because managing expectations is how you're really actually successful. And so when you're communicating your skill set and what you'd like to bring to the table and what you'd like to do for a company as you're seeking to transition into a role, being able to really speak to not only your network and your subject matter expertise, but your actual skill set is going to be incredibly important. That way you're managing the expectations of your hiring manager as to what you'd like to do and how you're going to do that. And when you're in a position where you have folks that you're delivering things to, whether it be a client or whether it be an internal stakeholder, it could be your boss or it could be your colleague. It's really important to be able to effectively communicate what exactly it is they want and when do they want it and what does that look like. And managing them by being able to say, hey, this is what I can accomplish now. These are my responsibilities. This is how long it's going to take. And this is what I can't do right now. And so for me, effective communication is all about understanding what are the priorities and what's going to get accomplished and when that's going to be accomplished. And I see that a lot as we're supporting companies through the regulatory process, as I'm managing my leadership team as to when we can get our work accomplished, which is a combination of programming and conferences that we host, as much as meeting with clients, as much as traveling to other countries and developing relationships with foreign governments, as much as with contract research organizations or service partners. And then there's managing expectations to my team. I have about a team of 5 folks that report to me. And it's how do I help them better do their job? And how do I remove roadblocks to them being able to perform their function? And what are my expectations of them? And when we need work done, and I'm delegating work to people, who's doing what, and being incredibly effective at communicating that. My boss is a perfect example of what not to do. He likes to write an email that says, "Hi, comma, this needs to happen, period, best, Jim," and it's like addressed to multiple people. And it's not clear who's supposed to take the lead on this one task that he just sent out. So I had to come in and actually put some structure and put some additional communication around the message so that it can be accomplished effectively. And so that's just, I know we're going to talk a lot about what we do, but I mean, for me, managing expectations and being able to clearly communicate what those expectations are and what can be accomplished is really the key to being successful. And so with that, I'll transition you over to Cindy.
Thanks so much, Ernesto. And it's so great to hear how different the perspectives are from both Steph and Ernesto, and at the same time, there's so much in common. I guess to introduce myself, so as Mo mentioned, I'm both a program manager doing drug development in industry at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. I am also an independent consultant at Yale University, where I work primarily with, or my primary client at the moment is an early career investigator who launched their lab just about the time that the pandemic hit. In fact, the same month that the pandemic hit and that we went on lockdown was when this investigator started their lab. So needless to say, it was a little bit of a troubling time, but I came in to really assist in creating a short-term and long-term strategy for how we would target funding, grants, how would we compose them, how would we, in addition to all of that, support the professional development of all the trainees that would be coming into the lab. Most of them at the time were postdocs, and so we wanted to ensure that they would get the support that they needed, both from a mentorship level as well as connections and collaborations being well established across both the institution internally, but then externally as well. So I think I sit at the crossroads, and I think I identified this at some point in the 2 postdocs that I did, that I really loved working with the experts, and I didn't sometimes enjoy being the expert. And it wasn't because of like imposter syndrome or something like that. I just found myself really enjoying the nature of collaboration. And I really enjoyed when I brought people together that speak different languages, right? Like one is a subject matter expert, like in a completely different area. And then you put them in the same room with, another subject matter expert from another completely different area. And then you present like this problem to them and they speak like these different languages, but when you finally get them to speak a common language, however that may be, they come up with something completely new and different. And I felt like, that has to be key to innovation. That has to be what drives science forward, from here on out. And here's how we're actually going to do this differently, right? And there's many sectors in science where that's still the case. People kind of work in silos sometimes, or they stick to their comfort zones. And so for some reason, I just had this capacity or this God-given talent, as I like to say, to bring these people at the table and to get them out of their comfort zone and to help them talk to one another. And so when I was a postdoc, both times, I was increasingly doing that. I was spending less and less time at the bench by virtue of just being entrusted with the responsibility to manage, more students and postdocs, et cetera. But also because every time I kind of gathered my slides in a similar way as what Steph was saying, right? I was kind of pulling out and making it really accessible. And so all the data that we had in the lab, I was like, why aren't we presenting it this way? This is so much more easy to understand. This is really going to bring value to who we're trying to speak to. And this is our audience. And I, for some reason, just felt like very connected with the concept of here's how we have to present our data to make it really easy to understand, right? And so I think that probably at some point that shone through. And so little by little, I was pulled to more like, let's talk strategy. Let's talk about what we're going to do with this data. How are we going to proposition it to the NIH? How are we going to proposition it to this funding agency? How are we going to proposition it to a collaborator that we want to engage and want to set up a working relationship with? And so the more and more I did that, and the more and more senior that I got, at the time that COVID hit, again, that same year, I started to explore more and more what would be some of the ways that I could do that in my career. And I started to kind of feel like maybe in academia, it was not the right place for me because I felt like there were several limitations. There are many great things about academia, and I have to be honest that for me, I don't have one of those horror stories, which unfortunately many other people have, which is, you know, they didn't get support from their postdoc mentor, or funding ran out, or what have you. You know, I was very fortunate, and I had a lot of support. Unfortunately, I had an illness at the time, and I wasn't sure whether I was ever going to get back on my feet again. And so I had to make some, you know, really key decisions. One of them being that I had to put myself in a situation where I could work remotely and have the, you know, prospect of being able to still have a successful career, even if I wouldn't be able to, you know, be physically in a lab again. And so by virtue of that, I started thinking, well, what are my strengths? What are the things that I'm good at? And around this time, that's when I got contacted by this Yale investigator asking me for help based on the evidence that she had seen, and the, you know, the success that I had establishing similar things in the lab where I was a postdoc. And it became clear that I could become this independent consultant, and I could also pursue, you know, what I thought I was doing really good in industry, where I could do it at a larger scale with a bigger team, you know, with more resources. And so I guess what I wanted to say about communication is the following. There are subject matter experts in many places that are creating a lot of data constantly. The problem with that is that sometimes they are too in the weeds, and it's either their job or someone's job or a community's job to understand what is the value of that data, who does it impact, and more importantly, how does it then lead to subsequent decisions about what the field is going to do next, or what's going to happen with that information. And so in my role as a program manager, both in industry and still in academia, my job is to kind of curate that information and think about what's the best way to present the value add to the audience is going to. And I have to be honest, I do this every day, multiple times a day, and it's all completely different audiences. Sometimes it's people like Ernesto who are business development. Their job is to figure from a business angle, is this worth money? Is this going to yield profit? But is it also equally valuable to a patient, to a, you know, a venture of some kind, right? And then there is times where we have to take the same exact data, but now look at it from a different angle and think, is that going to be of value to a patient advocacy group? Is that going to be of value to someone that wants to sell our drug, right? And so we constantly have to do that, both in academia and in industry, anytime we're pitching the data, even to get funding for it, right? So what I would say, you know, one of my key pieces of advice is get good at that. Get good at identifying the value behind not only your data, but others. Be an integrator, right? So if there's isolated data coming from one place and isolated data coming from another place, figure out when you put those together, is that added value add? And I think that there's many places that you can do that. You don't have to do it only in one place. As you can see, all of us here have multiple places where we've been able to do that pretty successfully. So the career options are out there. And I'm happy to talk more about, you know, other examples or times where maybe some of that has been challenging or relevant or so on and so forth. But that in a nutshell is me. Thank you.
Cindy, it sounded like you were saying, you know your audience as well, you know,
Exactly.
because it sounds, and which is what we do all the time. We're really catering to who we're communicating to. It reminds me of a saying that I learned a while ago. So the golden rule is to treat everybody like you would like to be treated, right? But do you know what the platinum rule is?
I forgot. Treat everyone the way they want to be treated, I think
Treat
it is.
everyone like they want
Yeah.
to be treated. Exactly. So and it goes, and I think that's kind of crucial to being an effective communicator. It's who are you talking to, and how do they like to receive that information? And if you guys haven't looked up the languages of love, do that. It'll do wonders for your relationship if you're in a personal romantic relationship, because that's like another level of understanding people. But at the end of the day, it does always boil down to knowing who your audience is and how they're receptive to information. because that's really key. And thank you for bringing that up. I thought that was really good.
Sure.
Sorry, go back to you.
Hey, no worries. This is y'all's show. But I guess to the many themes that we heard, so knowing your audience, having to communicate with different types of people, when you're at different places in the hierarchy, tailoring your message, making it accessible or less accessible if you're Steph's advisor or something. So I'm gonna pull Steph into this conversation, and since you've had a lot of experience, maybe translating communication or translating data information to a bunch of different audiences, whether that be the general public, that be students or incarcerated individuals. I'm wondering how, like, what are things that you think of to ensure that your message is relevant and accessible to the specific audience that you are tailoring it to?
Sure, that's an awesome question. And actually, my answer is very much a parrot of what Ernesto and Cindy have kind of already said. But I think for me, like the question I always ask my students when they're like starting a paper or a project is like, so what, who cares? Like, you have to convince me as your audience, as your reader, like, why should I be invested in this? Why should I read it past the first sentence? And so that, again, to go back to what Ernesto was saying, is like, how do I understand what my audience values and then speak in their language to communicate how this aligns with their values? And so another question that I find really helpful in framing my thoughts when sort of considering this topic is a question that Julian Treasures, who's like a communication expert, says, which is, what is the listening I'm speaking into? And so this is like getting at the idea that every person comes to the table with a sort of unique set of like biases and experiences in their life. So we listen through those filters, and knowing where the person that you're sort of communicating with is coming from will help you be a lot more adept at sensing the way that they are listening to you and what those filters might be that they're bringing to the table. The other thing I think a lot about, particularly because right now I'm in a public facing role in at Georgia Humanities, I think about what genre and what platform is going to be most effective. And so thinking about like, you know, should this be text? Should it be image? Should it be video, podcast? Like, where are we posting it? What social media platform? Like, all those things are actually fairly critical in terms of targeting effectively. And I do actually kind of the same thing when I'm teaching. Like, you'll never catch me standing in front of a classroom lecturing, like, ever. It's just not my jam. Like, I'm always showing like short videos, clips of a podcast, small group discussion. Like, we're always kind of switching it up. And that's, again, to sort of cater to the idea that like not every student sitting in a room is going to learn something the same way. And so trying to hit on as many different like learning styles as possible when teaching a concept so that everyone has like the best shot possible to sort of absorb the material. And that, again, sort of to go along with that, one of the initiatives I'm working on right now in my role as director of digital initiatives is a gamification strategy for teaching Georgia history to eighth graders, which is like part of their Common Core in Georgia, which is where I am. And this is like a strategy that, so gamification, just like sort of basically making Georgia history into video games, which could be horrifying if done incorrectly, but that's like a separate talk for another day. But it's been shown that when you incorporate games into education, student performance increases by almost 90%. And so again, that's just like, how does the medium in which I'm conveying information really impact the audience's ability to absorb and like digest that information? And so I think that pretty much sort of captures, I guess, the essence of how I think about being audience centric.
Amazing. Yeah, I am finding a lot of, again, overlap between what each of you are saying and thinking about my position as a PhD student and the people who are kind of in the audience of this panel. Right now, we're kind of in this like receiving end of courses and mentorship and guidance. And when we graduate, we're supposed to be kind of on the other side of that. We're supposed to now be the ones that are guiding and supporting others. And I'm wondering, Ernesto, you talked a little bit about your boss's communication strategies. Cindy, you talked a little bit about how to tailor to different people, the NIH versus, the community. And I guess I'm just wondering, anyone can kind of take this one, but how you navigate your different positionality in communicating, whether you are responding to communication that you're receiving versus if you are the leader of the communication itself. Why don't we start with Ernesto? We haven't heard from you, so.
Sure. So Mo, and and maybe you can rephrase the question. So my positionality, is that correct? Is that the phrasing you use? And how would you like me to, whether I'm the communicator or receiving the communication? What do you mean by that, so that I can best answer?
Yeah, I think this is a great example of how effective communication is so important, right?
Absolutely.
Phrasing the question in a way that it is comprehensible. So I guess what I mean is, let's say you are on the receiving side of that email. Hi, please get this done. Thank you. There's 4 people. If you were to try to communicate with a superior, how is this supposed to be delegated? It's not being communicated correctly.
Gotcha. So there are, and this is interesting because your so my personality and my personal communication style and my personal management style will influence how I will respond to something like that, in addition to knowing my boss and his style and what he likes. So I'm a very straightforward, clear delegator of and I want there to be absolutely no confusion when I'm saying something, especially if it's going to be over text, whether it's an email or a Teams message or a text message or a Slack message. And so and I know that especially like big picture folks like the CEOs and like the visionaries have a really hard time kind of getting into the weeds. What's great about folks with a PhD is that we can do the high level thinking and get into the weeds. And so we have a much more dynamic range as to how we communicate. But some folks, you'll notice, kind of hover at 100,000 feet, which is the genesis of these awful emails and awful phone calls that leave you oftentimes confused. So step one is if you don't know, it's always about asking for clarification. And that can be challenging. I had a PI who was a very well-known immunologist. He discovered IL-12. Giorgio Trinchieri has been cited by like a bazillion people, and a lot of people were intimidated by him. And so whenever there was like not clear, things weren't clear, it was hard for folks to sometimes go and ask for clarification. But I can't stress the need, just kind of like I did with Mo right now. Don't try to answer a question you don't understand or do something where the direction was not clear. It's really important, if you're the receiver of information, to ask for clarity. And then secondly, and this is goes back to like where my personality and my my management style comes in. Like, I won't ask Jim to clarify because there's really no point. I've known him long enough now that I'm like, this is gonna go, like, we're gonna go back and forth forever, and I'm never gonna get an answer. Because I'm like, who should do it? And he will reply, someone. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I take the initiative right away and start putting structure and operations and delegate the task and organize the task so that I know that it doesn't fall through the cracks and it actually gets completed. And sometimes, especially after you've given that responsibility within a group, you have the license to then do that. Back to when I was a postdoc at the National Cancer Institute, my PI was very non-confrontational. And like I would say that a lot of PIs are probably the least confrontational people in the world, which is why they decided to perhaps go into science, because they didn't have to confront people. Well, when you're in a leadership position, like a principal investigator, though, there's things that you have to tell people to do. And I was the lead on this project. My colleagues, who were my senior in terms of being in the lab and senior age wise, they weren't taking direction from me very easily, even though I had been told to by my boss to execute and drive this project. So I needed to manage up and tell him to tell them to do what I needed them to do, because I couldn't manage them directly. And that was an even harder thing to do, because I received the communication of what the task needed to be and how to get it done. And then I needed to go right back to my boss and say, all right, now I need you to do all these things and tell these people to do this for me to accomplish my job.
Yeah.
And that sometimes, and it takes a little bit of practice, but it's and now, especially if you're in graduate school, that's like the perfect time to build the confidence to be able to politely and congenially like express, hey, I need you to do this, because without your help it's not going to happen. And it's not going to be because I'm not trying or because I'm not capable. It's because I need other people to do what they need to do, and they're not listening.
Yeah.
I don't know, what do you think, Cindy?
Yeah, Cindy, I'd love to pass to you and maybe add in this question from the chat. Earlier, you talked about your God-given gifts, and um, to Roshni's question in the chat, what advice would you give to someone who may not have a God-given gift, but looking to improve their ability to influence and communicate effectively?
Yeah, thank you. I think there are so many good points from Ernesto. I think I can probably assert some of them from my own perspective. Getting to know your audience is so important. I think going back to that point we were making earlier, getting to know the audience is like really big part of the equation. So Ernesto is wise enough to know that his boss has a certain management style. He also knows, probably at this point, by virtue of working with him for long enough, what might grind his gears, but also what he might not do, right? So there's a kind of a level of anticipation that you have with your audience sometimes. And by virtue of that, that's kind of powerful because it gives you an ability to strategize. How are you going to influence this? There's a very big difference between influencing and manipulating. I will say that, big asterisk. Um, and so I think to Ernesto's point, right? Like one thing he could do is, as he said, he could email back and forth and like try to like work it out in that method, but that's probably not going to be the best. So he's probably at this point tried and failed in multiple things. And I think it's in that try and fail phase that people start to take it personal and think like, oh, I'm just not good enough at communicating. I'm just not good enough I'm not cut out for this, right? One of the things that I realized, and maybe one of the reasons why I became eventually a little bit better and a little bit better, and now I can manage more types of communications, is simply that I just didn't give up. I kept trying things and I kept asking for feedback and I kept trying really hard to understand who my audience was, right? So I'll give you an example. For the first 3 years that I was applying to NIH funding, I was not doing very well. My scores were not great. It just did not go that well. But I didn't take that just at face value. I went and I asked other people that were successful, like, what were you doing? And I was looking at other people's applications and I was interviewing people who were successful. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that you could add this and this and this here. I thought it was only this way. And so you could almost think that that is kind of like getting to know your audience, right? Because you're trying to understand what is essentially a study section going to perceive you like in your writing. And I think that's a little bit of what Steph was saying earlier too, right? She's doing gamification of learning. Why? Because her audience needs and desires to receive information a little differently than, let's say, others, right? And so I think this whole topic of understanding your audience, there's so much to be said about it. It is like a very profound topic. And to be honest, I think that one of the only ways to get to know your audience and to become more and more successful and wise at understanding your audience faster is simply to get more experience with that. So I would say, if you're trying but you're failing, don't give up, right? You're in the early part. It's your responsibility to take that failure and do something with it and use it as a learning experience, and kind of, figure out how to get feedback or figure out how to understand your audience better and better each time. And I think that level of dedication will help you get ahead in your career, because no matter which career you're in, you're going to need to know your audience and you're going to have to speak value into them.
That's really amazing. Um, yeah, knowing your audience and again, tailoring your message to them. I want to bring in a little bit more of each of y'all's backgrounds. So, Cindy, you have established this LinkedIn community. Steph, you do digital communications. Ernesto, you're kind of working with businesses and in industries and science people online, offline. And I'm really interested in how your communication strategies may differ between an in-person communication interaction versus one that's digital, whether that be through email or, social media platforms.
That's so in person versus, well, I mean, I'll tell you, I'll be completely honest. I think the only social media that I have left at this point is LinkedIn. And so, and so I think I experienced like the first iteration of Snapchat and the first iteration of, like whatever, Instagram and whatever, but then I gave up on everything over time. I don't even have Facebook anymore. And so I don't communicate often. Through social media, but we do communicate often through like an online kind of virtual platform like this. And this is typically how I have my meetings with clients. And so, and it's tough. It's tough. It's very easy to be distracted. It's very easy to miss something. You're clearly not getting all the information because you don't really have a ton of the other person's body language, and it can seem a little bit dry sometimes because everyone's online, and so like it's hard to chit chat. You just kind of get to the point, because when you're in person, there's typically like an experience as you leading up to the meeting that can help kind of break the ice a little bit. And that natural breaking of the ice with the other person that happens when you're meeting in person is often lost, or can be, in a virtual setting. And so I think that we just have to make more of an effort, to be engaging, and what that really means is trying to be as active listener as possible. You really can't make eye contact, and so like I look at the little green light on my camera so that it looks like my eyes are looking straight at you, even though like I'm not really looking at you. Because it's kind of all of these like subtle body language kind of things that kind of help keep your audience engaged. I talk a lot with my hands, and that's the Hispanic in me. Mexican parents, we talk a lot with our hands. But then when I'm dealing with my Korean clients, I've been told by our consultants that are boots on the ground in Seoul that like to not use so much body language, and to not. So then there are times where I'm like trying to subdue myself, like especially on camera, when I'm trying to communicate with an audience that isn't too receptive to folks, speaking like the way I do. Um, and so I just try to kind of tweak the approach a little bit more subtly, so that I just maintain the attention of the person if it's going to be through a virtual communication, media like this, a vehicle like this. And so I don't know, Steph, do you communicate? It sounds like you communicate a lot more through social media than I probably do.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what you said rings true to me. What I would add is that I spend a lot of time thinking through, again, just like what is the medium that I'm using? Like, am I like in person versus virtual, like there are some things that Zoom does like really, really well, and there are some things that it sucks at. And there are some things that you can do in person that you can't do on Zoom. So it's like, what is the format of this interaction, and how do I best use the tool that I have in front of me to make the most of that? And so it's just really understanding what are the tools that are available to me in this situation, and like what is the outcome I'm hoping for, and then sort of matching those two things together, if that makes sense. And so I think, you know, the social media stuff, honestly, once you understand like the medium and the form that you're engaging with, like what platform you're on really doesn't matter as much, as long as you're, you know, understanding how you're targeting to a particular audience. But for me, a lot of it comes down to like just knowing like, okay, Zoom is not great at like picking up nuances in body language. It's not great at like, you know, if you're like, I don't know. I mean, I like Zoom for a lot of things, so it's hard to say what it's not great at. But I think like, you know, in person is better if you're trying to like build a relationship with someone. Like it's really hard to build genuine relationships online to some extent. And so if it's a first meeting with somebody, maybe I insist that we meet for coffee instead of like hopping on Zoom. And I think that's another thing, is like I'm not afraid to say when I'm like, this is not going to work out the way that you're hoping, like we should do something different, we should try a different format, because your vision and your goal are not going to come out the way you think with, you know, the methodology you're, you know, thinking will work. And so I think that's me too. Like if you're not comfortable with like a particular forum or format, dependent on some, I mean, obviously there's some circumstances you can't control, but to some extent, like if there's flexibility, I would be assertive about what works for you and what doesn't. But I don't know if Cindy, if you wanted to add to that at all.
Thanks, Steph. I guess to kind of relate it to what Mo raised. So for those of you who don't know, I started about 2 months ago, a LinkedIn group that is dedicated to an audience composed of academics that are trying to transition from academia into industry. And part of the reason why I started that group was because that particular audience, many times, they just don't know how to kind of piece the steps that you would need to get from A to B, right? And I was getting at some point many messages over LinkedIn of people just curious, like, how did you do it? Can you help me? You know, and I started to realize that there was this really incredible need for people to have access to this kind of information of what are some of the skills that you have to develop. Who do you contact? How do you contact them? How do you use LinkedIn? So, you know, the way that I defined that audience, it was kind of like over time. Like I said, I was getting a lot of questions around that. And I realized that there was a need to address some of those concerns. In the group, the way that I, you know, address the audience is I try to speak to their fears, and I try to speak to their myths and the things that are not necessarily true, or the assumptions that are made. You know, many times people think, well, I don't have industry experience, so when I submit applications, I've been submitting applications for many months and they're going nowhere, and it must mean that I just don't have it. And, you know, what I do is I try to kind of get you to pressure test that assumption that that might not actually be true. It might be more to do with the way in which you're doing your job search that might not be helping you, and what kind of practices you could do instead. And so the way that I tackle this particular audience is getting at the heart of what's valuable to them, right? And it goes back to what I was mentioning very early on, when we started the panel, and I was mentioning how, you know, you got to take the material or the information or the data and present it to the audience in a way that's valuable to them. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do within this, you know, group, kind of being the conduit of some of that. And I don't intend at all to be the only person doing this. In fact, the reason why I built a group, as opposed to me just posting on my profile and that being the end of it, I made a group because I wanted to bring all the thought leaders that are actively engaged in this conversation, coaches, recruiters, hiring managers, other professionals who made the leap and, you know, now they're doing really well, bringing them all into like this group to help, you know, stir up that conversation and to help engage each other. Because I do believe that part of having a community is very important to be able to address the audience, right? So I think, you know, that's kind of what the focus of the group is currently. And certainly I invite anyone here who might be interested in participating in that to, you know, to join. And going back to what we were saying, and to your point, Steph, I think it's ultimately down. I think I will keep saying it over and over again. Get to know your audience and bring value to the table when it comes to them by understanding them more and more.
What's something that resonated with me, Cindy, was the alternative approach to looking for a job. I've never have been successful applying for a job online, like, ever. I think like my resume automatically goes to some like spam box somewhere.
That end.
So yeah, no, it's just awful. I did, and I have worked with recruiters before, and they've been really helpful. So I would encourage folks to reach out to recruiters, but also a lot of, especially companies that are maybe under 50 people in size, they're a little bit more open to suggestions as to who they might need. And so for this, when I started at this company, I actually wrote my job description. At the time, it was for a director of business development, and then I sent it to them with my resume. And the question was, I'm a director of business development. Do you need one? Like, this is all, because this is what I want to do. And I got a ton of no's, but then I got a couple of yeses. And it's a lot easier when, especially if you're going from academia to industry, to tell a company what you want to do for them and whether they need that work. That way you can, if you're going to fail fast and move on, but at least you're securing a job that you think that you'll really enjoy doing, which has been the case for me, thankfully. So yeah, alternative approaches.
Hey, I have to jump in here. We're running over our time, but it's been such a quick but insightful time together. Thank you all so much for being here. I just want to kind of highlight the main takeaways that I wrote down from each of you. We have managing your expectations. We have knowing your audience, no, identifying their values, maybe speak to their fears or myths that may be guiding them, and trying to tailor your communication to the specific person or people you are talking to, putting in the work, getting to know who your audience is. Thank you again for everyone for being here. I just want to call out tomorrow's events. We have another amazing day of talks and opportunities to connect with colleagues and experts. I especially want to highlight tomorrow's afternoon session, the Alumni Story Exchange, which is an opportunity for current students to connect with each other, and also alumni, postdocs, fellows, and kind of share your journeys with each other. So you can check out all of that on our WOBA app. And again, thank you, Cindy, Steph, and Ernesto for being here.
My pleasure.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.